You're listening to Beyond the Endpoint, a podcast from the Duke Clinical Research Institute. In this series, we're demystifying clinical research and answering your pressing questions about health and healthcare. You can find our full episodes at dcri.org/BTE.
Both during and in the aftermath of the 2024 US elections, there's been a lot of discussion about how we as a nation should be addressing some of our most pressing health challenges. And we thought that's a really good topic for us because there have been lots of rumors about what might be changed as President Trump's new administration gets settled into their roles. But what actually can be done, and what does it look like to try to affect change in US healthcare policies? And what kind of changes could be in the future for clinical research? We've got a great guest to help us make sense of it all today. I'm Manesh Patel, and I'm joined by my co-host, Emily O'Brien, who's going to tell us a little bit more.
Thanks so much, Manesh. We're recording today's episode on the day after the presidential inauguration, and I'm so excited to have Dr. Leslie Curtis as our guest joining us to shed some light on the subject. Leslie recently served as a senior policy advisor for the Food and Drug Administration, where she supported the FDA's evidence generation initiative. She's the co-PI of the NIH Pragmatic Trials Collaboratory, a faculty member in the Duke Clinical Research Institute, a professor in the Duke School of Medicine's Departments of Medicine and Pop Health, where she's my department chair, and executive core faculty member for the Duke Margolis Institute for Health Policy. She's a close colleague of mine who is also an incredibly talented vocalist. Leslie, welcome to the podcast.
It's great to be with you, and I will not be singing.
We should have included that as a requirement. We'll get you on the next one. So Leslie, first, congrats on your return to Duke, and now back to your day job. And I know you've been doing some reflecting, likely over the past couple of weeks and months as your tenure at FDA has come to an end. So I'd love to get into more of kind of what that was like and how your view on the way that regulatory processes and science work changed as a result. As we kick off, could you give us just a sort of general scope of what the FDA does and sort of how your work there fit in to the larger body of work and what they're responsible for?
Actually, the scope of FDA was probably the biggest surprise to me as I got there and began to learn more. Now, it shouldn't have been a surprise. Like, this is publicly available information, but because my sort of interactions with FDA had been along fairly specific lines, I didn't know that, for example, FDA regulates about 20% of the products that we in the US consume, right? That's a lot. And in terms of the US food supply, they have responsibility for regulating almost 80% of that. I think meat, poultry, and some egg products are outside of their remit, but everything else is in scope, right? So just when we think about the breadth of that remit, it really is impressive.
I've also always assumed that you had to learn at least 1,000 acronyms within the first week of getting started as you talk about all these different groups. So you didn't mention that challenge, but I imagine it was there in the background.
I still don't know them all. That's embarrassing. And after I was there for like a year, I realized I can't ask. I have to.
It's like the first rule of anything. You gotta learn all the lingo, and you gotta be able to say, this is what makes us different. Although it sounds like a lot of really important groups there.
And I think that's a good place to start because in that context, the sliver of piece that I was working on at FDA was actually quite small, even though it was very important to me and to those of us who were working on it. As you mentioned, I was working on the commissioner's post-market evidence generation initiative, right? Which when I say that, the first question is like, what do we kind of mean by that? So let me try to unpack that term. The way I think about it is FDA approval really is the beginning, not the end of understanding a treatment's full impact, right? So there are clinical trials before a device or drug is approved that really focus on safety and efficacy in specific populations for specific indications. But once that treatment gets into real world practice, the clinical landscape can really shift, right? So questions that just didn't even exist before approval suddenly exist after approval when it's in use. Think about how quickly in clinical practice the standard of care evolves. So if the trial that, the approval was based on was conducted 5 years ago, standard of care has likely changed and we'll have new questions about how that treatment works now. When we talk about that kind of post market evidence generation, one of the big challenges is that it's nobody's responsibility and it's kind of everyone's responsibility, right? The FDA has some regulatory authority in that space, but it's limited. Industry sponsors conduct some of these studies, but their questions are typically aligned with their commercial interests, which may or may not be the questions that clinicians and patients have, right? Government funds some of this, but they fund a lot of things, and so this isn't always the priority for them. Health systems and payers, have I would say, certainly have a reason to fund some of this work, but they historically have not. So it's one of those problems that lots of people have some interest in it, but the responsibility is shared. So a lot of things fall through the cracks. So the issue really isn't just about generating this evidence, but like how do we bring pieces together to do it in a more coordinated way, right? While I was at FDA, then the task that I had and my colleague Ali Abbasi, with whom I work closely, was like, how do we begin to bring together different pieces that are working on elements of this? How can we had projects, for example, one focused on really the data ecosystem that's needed to support post-market evidence generation. Others kind of focused on bringing agencies within HHS together who were already working on different pieces just to make sure that the connections and potential synergies were identified.
Just thinking through your experience and reflecting on the fact that we just had the inauguration and there's going to be changes always in general approaches of how people try to affect important things in our health and regulatory science, as you just highlighted. I wonder, as this transition happens, what does that look like? What's the way in which change could happen? How do we think about this, whichever side of the aisle you're on? I saw this SNL thing with Dave Chappelle, who was like, we're all rooting for this administration. However you are, everybody needs the country to get this right, especially for chronic health problems, where we see a lot of these issues. So, is it feasible? What's actually feasible to change? And are there going to be some surprise challenges people might see as they try to change the way in which we regulate food and think about how to get nutritious, less processed food to our communities?
Yeah, it's such an important question. I think there's often that perception that like a new administration, new leadership comes in and things change immediately, but in reality, and you're hinting at this, like these agencies, many of them, FDA certainly, they operate within long-standing kind of regulatory frameworks that don't change overnight, right? I think what new leadership can do, like they can set priorities, right? They can be clear about what the priorities are. And they do that by what they say publicly, by pulling together groups. I think they also have ability to shift some enforcement discretion, right? So things that they have the ability to enforce, but they haven't. That's where, we might see, I don't know, but there could be shifts there. And then, making decisions about what initiatives to move faster and what things to maybe slow walk or pause indefinitely. So that's where I would see maybe the early signals about what's likely to happen. I think it's important to keep in mind, though, like major regulatory overhauls, they require public comment, they require legal review, and sometimes Congress has to act. So, that doesn't spell fast. that, that
No,
that's
that spells slow, but hopefully meaningful. But there seems like a couple of places there one could make a change, and it might be around where focus is placed, or energy, or is put place.
I'd love to talk about that in a bit more detail. And Leslie, I know you were focused on the post-market space, but one of the things that's always been super interesting to me is how the FDA prioritizes what we might think of as like the hot topic items that are coming up in headlines. As Manesh mentioned, we've heard a lot about ultra processed foods, and red food dye was just banned after a number of rounds of review. Can you tell us about how, among all the topics in this big scope that the FDA is responsible for, how do they prioritize? Is it driven by that sort of multi-stakeholder approach and discussion that you're describing?
Some of it, so there might be, for example, an issue might have a lot of scientific momentum behind it. Like, there's really strong evidence that something needs to happen. Could also have a lot of political or public pressure for it. Is Congress pushing for something, or is there some public health emergency that's forcing this? Then, in order for something to actually get from idea to priority or policy, the agency also has to have the legal authority to act. And I mentioned that legal review before. That's really important, because if the agency doesn't and it plows forward, that action gets stopped in the courts pretty quickly. Right. So there are these considerations. So, once an issue kind of gets on the radar and is on the list of priorities, they do this internal evaluation about whether it can actually be regulated, or whether they have the authority to do it. Goes through like rulemaking, right, with proposed rules, and you get public input. That is a process that's designed to be deliberative, right? So we're not making sort of snap decisions based on just, say, one perspective.
Yeah, and to me, it strikes me as maybe one of the most common misunderstandings, just about this intersection between politics and regulatory science. I think sometimes the assumption is it's like this decision from on high, from a small group of people in a room somewhere, whereas like it's actually stepwise and focuses on integrating multiple perspectives and really trying to be as objective as possible. It sounds like, which I find comforting.
Yeah, right. It is. It's reassuring. There's a process that gathers a lot of perspectives.
Well, Leslie, as you were talking, I was thinking about, just the complexity of where we are in the world today. And it changes. Like, as a clinician, I hope we take proven things and use them as fast as we should. But the standard of care may take longer than we think, or may happen faster. And generating evidence should not only help clinicians, doctors, and patients, but people decide better information on what's proven or what might work for them. And that gets me to this common thing I hear a lot of these days, which is, you know, uh, politics, science, and evidence. I have a lot of people doing their own research, getting bombarded with lots of channels of information. And that's okay. I want people to, but I guess what I'm trying to understand is, how does the average person in this world of so much information, when they get that thing across their email, or that story they read, that this may cause this, whether it's a food issue, caffeine can make you live longer, maybe not. Almonds do help you, they don't. Are there hallmarks that people can look for? Is there ways that they think of, whether it's the science, the way the science is conducted, or some basic principles they should be looking at if they're listening to this podcast in their home, saying pretty thoughtfully, like one of our co-hosts in the past said, Manesh, what is the link between salt and hypertension? I was like, I think it's a pretty strong link, but people could have different views about that. So what would somebody look for to try to say, hey, this seems more reputable than some of the other things that you can see or understand?
I think about conversations that I've had with relatives, parents over the years, right? Like, what do you think about this thing that I just heard? So a few things that I say, like, one, just check the source, right? Is it coming from like a scientific journal? Is it, or something someplace reputable, right? So always check the source. Maybe the biggest bit of advice is just be really skeptical of any language that's pretty extreme, right? So if it sounds really exciting,
Oh, right. Yeah, yeah, yeah. No,
read
it's going to make
further
you live
and see
so
where
much longer if you do these things, right?
right. See where it's coming from. If it's real, you're going to see that people agree on it, right? It's not going to be just one source telling you this is true. So I think it's the reality in which we live now. We are bombarded with all sorts of, I'm not going to call it information, just noise, a mixture of noise, information, everything, that it's become increasingly challenging to separate what's real from not.
Yeah. small piece there might be, how do they decide what is like something that's associated with a finding versus something that might be causing an issue? This is a common thing that I'm sure you all think of all the time in sort of population health, but half of the stories I see are things that sort of I tell patients travel together or they're actually causing the issue that we get to. And how do we make sure people keep an eye out for that?
Oh, that's such an important distinction, and that is something that I talk to people about as well, right? Just like you should be skeptical of extreme language, be skeptical when you see something written saying that something causes something else, right? More often than not, what they are describing is what you've just described, right? These are things that travel together, and we know they travel together, but we don't really know which one happens first or if they travel together for some other reason. So I think that's important, and it also, there's the onus is on us, I think, as scientists, to be very clear in terms of how we describe the work that we're doing and what the findings actually mean, for people who are reading. I think we have a lot of work to do there.
Since we're sort of talking about clinical research, obviously this is coming from the perspective of someone who does this as a day job, but we've obviously been hearing a lot of discussion about the funding environment. And I read today in another forum that 4 in 10 dollars of Duke's operating budget are research dollars, which I thought was incredible. We do a lot of this work, and we certainly have a lot of people who are focused on, as you mentioned, trying to disentangle these complex associations, right? Figure out what's traveling together versus causal. So I think there are a lot of nerves about any changes that might be coming down the pike with respect to that funding environment. I know it's not totally an area of focus that you've been thinking about a lot at FDA, but can you talk about generally what kinds of changes you think might be coming that might affect clinical research funding and our ability to, as Manesh describes, do this good work?
Yeah, well, we've certainly heard a lot of language about shrinking the federal government, right? Like shrinking dollars in the federal government, which would have an impact on dollars flowing out of the federal government from the NIH, from other sources of funding for those of us in the research community. It's really hard to predict exactly how that plays out, in part because those dollars that flow from the NIH and from other federal funders, they go to states, they go to institutions who rely on those dollars. And so oftentimes in the past, certainly, members of Congress have been very supportive of maintaining those funding streams to their states, right, and to the institutions in their states. So I say all of that because we don't really know what's going to happen and how this will all shake out. I think for those of us who depend on research dollars to do science and to do the work that we love, we need to keep our ear to the ground, like stay attuned to not only what changes are likely to happen, but also where the emphasis is likely to change. I'll give an example, right? I mean, many of us have been working in the area and developing ideas at the intersection of climate and health, right? Now, I suspect that there are some topics related to climate and health that will be of little or no interest for the next few years, right? I also expect that questions about sort of the economic impact of weather events on health systems, on health, on people, I think that's probably going to be of interest, right? And we look around and see why that would be the case. So as we're keeping a careful tabs on what's happening with funding, like let's also pay attention to where the opportunities are and how we can reframe what we're doing so that it aligns with priorities that are stated.
Yeah, and we've also had some discussion about how there's some silver linings with that, right? That, like you mentioned, some of the fund flow shifts that are possible to more sort of state level administration, which, there are opportunities there to take a more local or regional kind of view, maybe deeper dive into some of the risk factors that we think about from an epi perspective, the environmental risk factors and healthcare access risk factors. So I think there's good reason to be optimistic that even if there are shifts, we could still end up answering some really interesting questions.
Yeah, I think that's right. And, funding matters a lot for everything. And we've talked a little bit about, if the NIH gets less, or pharmaceuticals or device companies or things that make products, whether they're food or otherwise, the hope is that they still have to cross a bar. So somebody has to fund the research to get it. And hopefully we're asking for good research. But because I hear, I'm not sure about that science because it was funded by X or Y. And there is obviously, again, inherently bias. And of course, things are going to have to be funded, but it seems like you should be able to still get to the science. So how do you evaluate funding for people that go, I'm so worried that the funding makes it so potentially biased that I'm not sure what to make of the results?
We do hear that. We do continue to hear that quite a bit. So I have a couple of responses to that. I mean, one is, for those of us who do that research with a bunch of different kinds of sponsors, whether they be industry or federal, we certainly Duke researchers, we have really strong contracts that at the end of the day protect our ability to publish what we find, right? So I would say, I hope, and I believe that over time that has become the norm, not the exception, right? So oftentimes when people are suspicious about findings that they see, like, well, let's look at, maybe they were funded by an entity that has commercial interest in that, but let's look at the makeup of who was on the study, who did the study. That's research that then goes into the sort of regulatory process, right? So let's take it that way, right? So comes out and it's been approved by FDA, and it's but it's a drug that was made by a company, because they all are, right? There, that approval, that decision is made based on the science, kind of full stop.
Yeah, and I think that's a really important point, right? I mean, I think the reason I think the FDA in our country plays a role in national and international health is that, at first, to your point, I think I wish it was different, but I've probably published more neutral to negative studies than positive studies saying something works, and that's just the way science works. I wish, more breakthroughs, but there are many products that don't make it there because they're really not better. And then to get an approval, even though the approval is the start of evidence generation, it is really based on a priori saying, this is what you're going to show. Did you show it or not? Whether it's federal, device, drug, or others. And that one could argue, hopefully, that comes across. So if everything coming from a group is always positive, then you do worry. If everything coming from a group is always negative, you might also worry.
So, Leslie, I've heard you say this before, and I come back to this when I get a little bit nervous when I think about all the changes that might be coming. But you say and have said that whenever there's change, there are opportunities for progress. And maybe this is like department chair lingo, but I think that you may actually really believe this. And so I'd love to hear you talk a little bit about what you're optimistic about. So you've seen kind of the inner workings on the FDA side, and now you're back at Duke. What are you excited to dive into, and maybe what are you excited about more broadly beyond your clinical research role about any changes that might be happening?
That isn't just, I do in fact believe that it isn't just, the lingo that I whip out during difficult difficult discussions with faculty, although I probably do that as well. I'll tell you, reflecting on my time at FDA, something that gives me great cause for optimism, just the caliber of the people who are working there, right? And not just working there like temporarily like me. These are people who've dedicated their careers to doing the work that FDA does, right? So I'm telling you that is cause for optimism for all of us. And I had the opportunity to interact with people in other HHS agencies similarly dedicated. So I'm like, look, there's so many great people focused on important issues, and I do believe that will continue. I also see that issues that are being really elevated around chronic conditions, right? Chronic illnesses. issues around, the quality of the food that's offered and what that looks like across our country, right? I feel like these are important issues that we can we can all get behind. I mean, they matter for public health. Absolutely, right? So I remind myself that we do have some really important shared priorities that I think could really help us make together. We could make some progress in those areas. I do think we're also like on, we see what's happening with AI, right? We see how rapidly that technology is evolving. And maybe sometimes that's a little alarming. I also see great potential benefit, right? So I would encourage all of us as we look at the things that are like, that might seem to be negative or frightening, try to really identify where the opportunity is, where the question is that we can answer that then moves us all forward.
Yeah, I'll also say, for a government agency, I think the FDA is like pretty on top of these emerging, some of these emerging tools and technologies. I mean, they've issued, I think, several guidances related to AI and machine learning. I mean, to me, it indicates not just acceptance, but a willingness to be engaged with the progress and really welcoming what it might mean for population health and how we can best use it, and wanting to help other people also use it in a responsible and appropriate way. So I see that as a really great sign that the the collaboration and sort of shared responsibility that you've talked about and published about could happen for us.
I'll just say it's been a great conversation, and I am hopeful. Obviously, Leslie's so nice and so thoughtful that I'm hopeful because of just a few things. One to what you said, Emily, is that I see AI as the yin and the yang of this. This is a place where we really do need the FDA because there's so many claims, so many things these things could do. We don't know enough about them in some of these black boxes to say it's not doing that. So you really do need science and some ability to do that. And then the opportunity for improved human health is there. So I think it's really incumbent, and I'm excited to see the FDA move. But I'm taken back to the more optimistic thing, which is I'll just say, you know, I know that many of the people, including Leslie, could do so many other things in their lives. And so taking really smart people who then sacrifice time, effort, energy to serve both locally, globally, and to help with our country through the FDA or other government agencies at a time like today, I think the day after inauguration is really meaningful. So I'll just say first, thanks to you, Leslie, for your service to us, because these are service jobs, and I think that matters a lot to us. And then I hope you keep teaching the next generation to do the things you've done, because that matters. So thank you. And it was really great to hear about sort of the way you have experienced and helped us think about evidence generation at the FDA.
Well, thank you. It's been a fun conversation.
Thanks, Leslie. And I'll say we always have a spot open for a cameo for our intro outro music if you change your mind about sharing the vocal talents that you've been blessed with.
Yeah, I'll do the backup beatbox while you're singing. If you need that.
Great. Now we're gonna
Yeah,
jingle for
all right,
y'all,
that's great.
okay?
Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Leslie.
This is Beyond the Endpoint, a podcast where we bring personal and expert perspectives on healthcare and clinical research to the casual listener. Stay tuned after the interview for a breakdown with the hosts. They'll talk through key takeaways and what this week's topic means for you.
Wow, well, that was really fun talking to Leslie. It's been a while, and it's great to have her back and thinking about stuff, and understanding how the FDA thinks about evidence generation. I wonder, Emily, you've known her for a long time. Really a broad swath of stuff Leslie's done. Anything from that conversation that really surprised you?
What I'm not surprised by is that Leslie did very well in a role that required multidisciplinary collaboration, which it sounds like is a central aspect of what they do, because she's had some great practice at that over the years, just through her projects and her various roles within the School of Medicine. I think we all look to her as a leader in these times of change, and we've seen that at a local level with creation of this new department 5 years ago, and she's really been a fantastic voice for all of us and sort of setting the tone for what we're trying to do. And I heard a lot of that today. I mean, I heard a lot of optimism. One thing that I think is so important for all of us to keep in mind is that we want the same things, right? No matter which side you align with, if any, maybe you don't even care about politics at all, but like, we want to be healthy. We want our kids to be healthy. We want to enjoy our lives. We might disagree on the right way to get there, but I'm really encouraged by what sounds like the perspective that she took back from her work, which is like, let's identify the places where we're aligned, and like, let's work really hard to to make progress there. And at the same time, let's work on the hard stuff where we do need to come to more agreement. And it sounds like from her experience that we have the right people who are working on that at the agency, which I think is just really encouraging.
Honestly, for so many years of my life, and I hope we get back to this, I thought a lot of the science that's needed to figure out if something works for health was not a political thing. And I'm not suggesting there can't be political aspects to these things. I'm just saying I thought that, we grew up in a world where you do in a scientific experiment, you measure the outcome, you decide that do what you thought it was going to do, you report the results, positive or negative, and then you go about the business of the rules of how that works. I know that's Pollyannish and the world's not so clear that way. I hope the listeners with us today, as they think about just how we are delving beyond the endpoint, how we're thinking about how does science happen, who are the people working on all sides of the aisle, all parts of health. We're all rooting for a healthier country. We're all rooting for ways in which we can make sure we can lean on each other to get through what is going to clearly be for all of us, whatever you see of the world, that the world is going to continue to be places where the greatest discoveries in health don't get to everyone who needs them. And so we're working as a group to try to make sure we improve health. So it's always fun to talk to someone like Leslie, who's got some of those same ethos and positive outlook. And then, it is a service job. And I was really taken aback by the ability for her and others to really commit to us to do that. So, I wish well for everyone doing this in the government to keep helping us get to the right place.
So thanks for joining us for this episode of Beyond the Endpoint, and thanks again to Dr. Curtis for sharing her insights today.
Yeah, we'll be back in a couple of weeks with another episode.
This has been Beyond the Endpoint. Resources related to this episode are available on dcri.org/BTE. If you have any burning questions about clinical research or healthcare, drop us a line at beyondtheendpoint@duke.edu. We'd love to address your questions in a future episode.